It is an unbelievable, irresponsible arrogance that we are seeing coming out of Kim Jong-un at this time.
There are certain things that we do work with Russia on, and then there's certain things when they do something wrong, I have no problem calling them out on it. Had we gotten in there sooner, had we stopped the abuses of their people sooner from Assad, we could have actually maybe prevented all that's happened.
For those that don't have our back, we're taking names.
The Human Rights Council is so corrupt.
When I send her over to speak to China, and when I send her over to speak to everybody, I think we're gonna do a lot of great things, Nikki, right?
Good evening, and if you'll please welcome Ambassador Nikki Haley with me tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be interviewing her in front of this audience tonight. Some of you may know her. I first met her as Governor Nikki Haley from the great state of South Carolina, and so it's fun tonight to see her now as the UN ambassador representing all of us. In fact, since we're the last superpower, you might say she's representing the world. A lot of big issues tonight. We just watched the doctors on the front lines. And it's incredible, isn't it, what these women do on the front lines?
It really is, and it's, heartbreaking to see what's happening in Syria. But if you just look at what happened a few days ago, as if the chemical weapon attack wasn't enough, to think that all of these people went to the hospital to get care, and you had doctors and nurses and people working on them, and then a bomb hits right there in the hospital. And so these people died saving lives of others. And it's just a heartbreaking situation. But what those doctors do is beyond sacrifice. It's beyond courage. And it is truly, it's a thankless job, but it's one I'm so thankful that they do it, because it really is a tough one.
Here's the thing I struggle with. This first came to light about 2012. We first started discussing the chemical weapons in Syria. And then there was an agreement with Russia and Syria to get the chemical weapon stockpile out of Syria. And now we're hearing about it today. But in fact, there have been many reports that this has been going on several occasions since 2012, and the world has sort of looked the other way until now.
Russia, if they supposedly have so much clout in Syria, then they need to do their job, because they're the ones that told us that they would handle the chemical weapons. They would get them out. They'd make sure nothing happened. All they've done is 7 times veto against Syria every time they do something to hurt their own people. And so Russia absolutely has not done what they're supposed to do. The chemical weapons attacks are not stopping, and it's brutal to see what they're doing to their own people.
President Trump has been critical, of course, of what's going on in Syria, of Assad. And he has been critical of President Obama, saying that he didn't act enough. I'm paraphrasing him, back in 2012 and 2013. But we have not heard much from him about Russia. Why? Or maybe I should say, let me put it this way. What do you think we should do about Russia? And in your last response, you put the target on Russia. What should we do about them?
Well, I think, first of all, keep in mind that I work for the Trump administration. And if you haven't heard me talk about Russia...
Hold on, stop. We got to get people fix these problems,
Yeah, I have hit Russia over the head more times than I can count. And it's because if they do something wrong, we're going to call them out on it. And if they want to help us defeat terrorism, fine. But the things they've done with Crimea and Ukraine, the things they've done in how they've covered up for Assad, those types of things, we're not going to give them a pass on. And so I have had conversations with the president where he very much sees Russia as a problem. And I think if you look at his actions, everybody wants to hear his words, but look at his actions. The 2 things that Russia doesn't want to see the U.S. do is strengthen their military and expand energy. And the president has done both of those. And so when you look at the actions...
All right, let me talk. I spoke many times over the years with Ambassador Samantha Power, your predecessor, and there's always the frustration of UN ambassadors is to try to get these countries, whether it be Russia, to do the right thing. Do you, I realize you're just sort of new to the job, but do you have that sort of frustration? Because, there's so many things we want these nations to do well. We want them to stop doing certain things or to do certain things. What's the frustration on the job?
No, that's not the frustration, because as you saw today, we absolutely went after Russia, we went after Iran, we went after Syria, and called them out on the chemical weapons.
Do they care? Do they care when we call them out? When the U.S. calls them out at the UN, do they seem to care?
Today they did. Today they did.
And how did that manifest itself?
Well, it started out to where they were all kind of very adamant that they were not going to move forward with this resolution. And after we got done with the hearing, Russia quickly wanted to have a meeting with the P5. And so the fact that they were starting to say, okay, how can we work this out? How can we work this out? That's a sign of moving the ball. And what we have to do is lead. And the way you lead is to make sure they know what you're for, they know what you're against, and they never question where you are. And one of the text messages I got from the ambassador on the Security Council today was, he said, "Thank you for what you said today. It's so good to see America lead." And that's what we're trying to do.
In terms of Russia, in terms of dealing with Russia, I imagine it would be profoundly easier if we had the same set of facts. Russia says that the ones with the chemical weapons was not the Syrian government, but that it was the rebels. So how do you, in your job, how do you sort of impinge on the Russians when they say that it's not their pal Assad, but rather it's the rebels?
Well, we called them out on it because they basically said there was this big container of chemical weapons that ISIS had. And there's not a picture, there's not an ounce of proof. They just make things up. And that's what we said.
Is there? How does Syria respond? How does Syria respond to this? Do you have any interaction with Syria on this?
Syria was there at the Security Council, and of course they throw their hands up and say it wasn't us, it wasn't us. But I'll tell you this: what's fascinating is the Security Council saw a problem with chemical weapons. So what they said was, we need to have an unbiased investigative mechanism that goes in and decides exactly who's at fault for the chemical weapons. So they created this investigative mechanism. All of the Security Council agreed on it, including Russia, including China, everybody else agreed to it. And the investigative mechanism has come back and said out of 4 chemical weapons attacks, 1 was ISIS and the other 3 were the Syrian government. And now all of a sudden Russia's saying, well, we don't trust the investigative mechanism. If you say what they want to hear, they like it. If you tell them the truth, they don't want to hear it.
So how does this play out? I realize that sort of the UN, much like the State Department, is soft power, and it's diplomacy is so potent.
Greta, we don't do soft power.
Well, it's like soft power in the sense that, is that the United States has been very generous in terms of whether it's humanitarian relief, whether it's, helping supply medical supplies. Soft power in that way. And and look, if this were an easy issue, you and I wouldn't be talking about it. Nobody'd be talking about it. Nobody knows how to solve this problem. We listen to these doctors. It's like, everyone's frustrated, everyone's confused. But I'm trying to think, what do you think we can do besides calling them out of it? How do we get that to move it from giving them hell to getting to stop it?
Well, a couple of things. So now we're trying to negotiate a resolution to actually go after and call out Assad and actually put monitors on the ground to see who was flying planes when the chemical weapons came out, who was flying helicopters, make them give us all those lists and show us exactly what happened. That we're working on, and hopefully tomorrow we'll have some resolution to that. But I think the other side of it is you have to look at the peacekeeping situation, which is one of the biggest things that the United Nations does. And when you look at peacekeeping, you have to say, what was the original intent of the peacekeeping mission? Are we actually doing what we promised the people we would do? And are the people being lifted up and in a better situation? And what you've found is there's all these peacekeeping missions and they've lost their way. They're not even focused on the people that actually need the help. And so what we've said is, let's go back, make sure that our goal is doable, and then make sure that the aid that we want to get to them is actually getting to them. In some cases, what we're seeing is the troop contributing countries, when the opposition comes or the extremists come, they stay in their barracks and leave the people hanging, or they run, and the people who they're supposed to be protecting are just standing there. And we've got to make sure we're putting pressure on the contributing countries. We've got to make sure that the governments themselves will allow the aid in. We're seeing that with South Sudan. We're seeing that with a lot of different areas. Democratic Republic of Congo we just worked on. They're not allowing the aid in. And when that happens, you can't keep working with the government. You have to start punishing the government.
Well, you brought up South Sudan. Right now, South Sudan is in a famine, and this is a man-made famine because of war. There's a civil war going on with the president, Salva Kiir, and his vice president. Terrible situation. People are literally starving to death, and we have peacekeepers there. It's not getting better. What is the UN doing about those people? There's a lot of attention because we have these vicious and cruel photographs coming out of Syria, but we have a very vicious situation in South Sudan.
Well, I think that you're seeing a lot of attention from a lot of countries saying we have to help them. And the Secretary General has come together and said, look, we've got 4 major areas where we're seeing famine. We've got to do something. I do think we're going to see famine by summer. Some areas we've already started to see it, and then we're just going to continue to see it roll. And so we've got to come together on the aid, but make sure that the aid is actually getting to the people before it's too late.
How do you get Americans to really care about this issue? I mean, I know they care about it if they see about it, but they're thinking about problems back home. And how do you tell them that it's important for America to lead in the world?
See, I think America's a very generous country, and we are very emotional people. And we respond to images. We respond to heartbreak. We respond to things that we see are wrong that need to be right. That's what makes us great. And so I don't think you have to convince the American people that we've got people dying in the world.
But I'll tell you that every time that that I post on Facebook about people in a particular part of the world needing help or something, I can't tell you how many emails I get or posts that say, "Well, what about people here?" I mean, and that is a headwind that that a lot of people run into when they talk about leading in the world.
We just have to tell the story. We have to tell the story. And when you tell the story, it's hard for people to look the other way. It's like today when we were telling the story about those children that had the chemical weapons attack. I mean, I held up pictures. They needed to see it. They needed to feel it. And they couldn't, and they tried to turn away. And that's when I said, look at these pictures. You have to make them feel it to understand the horror or the tragedy that's going on.
Israel in the UN. That's been a big topic that you've been discussing in the UN. What's your thought on that?
I had heard how bad the Israel bashing was, but when I got there, it was really bizarre. Because what you saw was the fact that we would have this session on the Middle East. This session happens every single month and has happened for the last 10 years. And all they talk about is Israel and the Palestinians. They don't talk about anything else. They don't talk about any of the other issues. And it's become a habit. And then you have this report that comes out from one of the UN offices overseas that compares Israel to an apartheid state. And so I called the Secretary General and I said, this is ridiculous. We cannot have this. He agreed. He pulled the report down. And the director resigned. It's just a habit of Israel bashing because they can. And what we're saying is it needs to be fair. We have to start seeing some fairness there.
All right, let me talk a little bit about the job.
Yes.
All right, you've been there less than 100 days, right?
Yes. 2 months.
All right, tell me, what is the difference for you from being between governor of South Carolina and being ambassador? I mean, I know that the job description is a little different, but tell me what's like for you, the 2 jobs.
The world is really big.
Bigger in South Carolina.
South Carolina.
It's bigger in South Carolina.
Yes. I think in South Carolina, I very much felt responsible. I felt like I needed to take care of the state, and that was every aspect of the state. And dealing with the world issues that we're dealing with, there's so many moving parts, and we have to convince certain countries to act or not act, and we have to try and deal with the personalities of each country and what they're thinking and what they're doing. So there's just a lot more negotiating in this job than there was in South Carolina.
It's sort of interesting that we oftentimes find ourselves in the United States dealing with people whose values we don't agree with, leaders. And I always sort of wonder, how do you rationalize dealing with some of these people who are dictators?
Again, you call them out when they do something wrong, and you work with them when you can find ways to work with them.
I guess I would find that frustrating. It's like,
we have to express America's values. We are always the moral conscience of the world. And so our focus is to make sure that we're...
Anyway, moving on along. All right, let me ask you, there are certain people like Aung San Suu Kyi in Myanmar is a woman she's a pen pal, in fact, during the... Who has now become a democratically elected leader, and in the meantime, there's been persecution of the Rohingyas in the northwest part of the country. How do we deal with Myanmar? We've now reduced some of the sanctions there, yet some of the problems that we had hoped would disappear have not disappeared.
We have to keep looking. You know, the one thing that I feel like the UN has done is it's become stale. And so with certain issues, they just push them to the side. And they think that because they've dealt with it once, they don't have to deal with it again. And I think what we have to do is, once something happens, we just have to stay on it. We have to make sure it's still working. And when we see something wrong, we've got to self-correct. And what's been the nice surprise is the other members, Security Council members and other member states, they agree with us. They also think that the UN has gotten stale, and they think that we can do more. And what I hope the United Nations realizes, talk less, act more, and make sure that we're doing all that we can to correct some of these situations.
Challenges of the job, what are they?
The fact that any given day something could happen. You know, North Korea, you know, had its failed missile launch. We had the Syrian chemical weapons, and every time something happens, we have to respond.
Has there been any sort of sense of North Korea just shot another missile off, and of course this is in advance of the president meeting with the president of China in a summit, and I assume that was somewhat provocative or in some way related to that. But is there any sort of discussion about North Korea shooting off that missile and its growing nuclear abilities?
Absolutely. I mean, you look, and here's a country who not only had 24 ballistic missile tests last year alone. This year, we've seen them turn around and put multiple ballistic missile tests. At the same time, we've seen the assassination of his stepbrother. I mean, all of these things continue to happen, and China has to step up. The only one that North Korea will listen to is China, and China has played footsies with us for 25 plus years. And now is the time where they can't talk about how bad they feel. They need to act on it.
So what do we do? And look, I'm not suggesting that North Korea is an easy solution. If it were, the last two presidents would have solved it and did not. But do you have any suggestion? We keep sort of relying, outsource it to China. Maybe that is our best recourse. But how do we get China to take more responsibility or to do those things which we think will effectuate those things to get them to shut down their nuclear program?
I think that the conversations that happened this weekend with the president and President Xi are going to be extremely important. I think we need to remember that all of the things that China provides to North Korea is the reason North Korea listens to them. China's not even going through with the original sanctions by the United Nations. They haven't even imposed all of those. So we've got to tell China, if they really condemn North Korea, don't just write a statement and tell us you condemn them, show us that you condemn them. And I think that China will have a decision to make. And either they're going to have to come down hard on North Korea, or we will.
All right. Women in the UN. This is a summit involving women leadership in the world. Tell me, give me an idea of the women's presence in the UN.
It's amazing. I think there are some very strong leaders. You really do get the feeling that you're seeing the best and the brightest that a country has to offer. The women in the United Nations so far, from what I can tell, are very close-knit, very tight.
Who's your best friend in the UN? Come on, tell me, what countries do you hang with?
Well... Right now, it's been a lot of. I'm the president of the Security Council, so that's what is.
So do you have any friends there? You got some friends there.
No, look. The UK is fantastic. Matthew Rycroft is great. France has been great. They're all great. The one thing about the United Nations is, in South Carolina or anywhere else, political political tactics can be pretty brutal. In the United Nations, there really is a respect for each other. There really is an understanding of the sacrifice and the respect. Even if they can't go along with you, everybody really does like each other at the end of the day. And it's a nice thing to see.
I get the idea that, I mean, we're so partisan in Washington, obviously, but I get the idea that the problems, there's so many problems that are so extreme, like Syria, that it really does sort of drive nations together to take responsibility and to try to leadership, even though these seem like oftentimes insoluble problems and appear to be.
No, it's exactly right. And, you know, every country realizes there's a lot of issues in the world, and every country does want to be a part of the solution. You've got a few bad actors out there, and the key is they were waiting to see what the U.S. was going to do. And one of the first meetings I had with an ambassador the first week was, we just need the United States to lead. And they just want to know what we're for and what we're against, and they want us to move. And so I think that's what we're trying to do.
Ambassador Samantha Power, your predecessor, do you have much contact with her? Is there much guidance from her on the job or any back and forth?
She was very helpful to me as we were coming in. We got to be friends, and we talked on the phone quite a bit. We emailed back and forth. She gave me kind of a, this is what you need to get ready for, this is what's going to happen, and gave great advice. And so I appreciate her service and her leadership in what she did at the United Nations.
So do you like the job?
I do like the job.
Why?
I do like the job. I like the job because you can move the ball. It's not just about talking. You can actually negotiate. You can actually change things.
How much interaction do you have with the president, with Washington?
A lot. I mean, I talked to him this morning, and I'm usually in D.C. at least once a week, if not twice a week, for the National Security Council meetings. And you know, I mean, it's not just with him, but it's with the entire team of the National Security Council.
Do you deal with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Do you deal with on Capitol Hill?
Yes. Last week I was with senators on the Foreign Relations Committee as well as the appropriators. So I try and keep them informed of what's going on, and especially with everything with the budget, I'm trying to talk to them about what's needed and which peacekeeping issues we're working on and those types of things.
Do you ever deal with any of the women presidents, like President Johnson of Liberia? There are a lot of women presidents around the world. We don't have one, but the president of Liberia.
I have only been there 2 months, so no, we have not had the opportunity to do that yet.
Any regrets?
No.
I'm taking the job.
No, there's no regrets. I think that, you know, I'm the daughter of Indian parents where my mom always said, whatever you do, be great at it and make sure that people remember you for it. And so my focus is just to try and do the job as best as I can.
And you come from a military family. Your husband's been deployed. Your brother's been deployed.
I am the wife of a combat veteran, so I very much know what military families go through. I know the sacrifices. I know the importance of decisions that are made. I saw that with my brother, and thank you. And I saw that when my husband was deployed to Helmand Province 2 or 3 years ago, and what these men and women do. It's not just a sacrifice by the soldiers, it's a sacrifice by the entire family, and it's really amazing to be a part of that group.
Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. You know, if these problems were easy, we would have had them solved a long time ago. Anyway, thank you very much.
That's right.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Greta.